he met somebody who told him about the job at Smith?
No. Not quite. There was a guy, his name just went right by me. Because, in the sanatorium, they're often maybe...
Lying next to each other.
They were lying
Yeah.
in beds next to each other. And there were some very interesting people in the sanatorium. And there was one particular guy who was stationed in the bed next to Dad for many months, and they would have long talks about philosophy and history and religion, all kinds of things, and art and architecture and things like that. And Dad spoke very eloquently about what he felt good architecture was, and so forth. And we'd spent this incredible time in Italy with the magnificent exposure to art and everything. And I forget his name, but anyway, he'd made a big impression on this guy. And it was close to a year later, after Dad's operations and everything, that when the guy who had always taught architecture at Smith College retired, they were looking for a new teacher. This guy had subsequently been released from the sanatorium, and I don't think he was on the Smith faculty, but he was very close to a lot of the people in the art department there. And he said to somebody, you really ought to get in touch with this fellow, Peter Garland. He's a really interesting person. And that was right after we had arrived here. We were living at the Leyland House up on the old Antrim Road. And this letter came asking Dad if he would consider coming to Smith and teaching architecture. He never thought of teaching at all. It had never crossed his mind. And we just moved to New Hampshire, and we just had this brand new little baby, and we're about to just start a whole new life. And I will go back to why we came to New Hampshire, because I realized I skipped over that. But he did sit down and write a very thoughtful letter to the head of the art department at Smith, and said, the kinds of things that the humanistic things that you ought to look for in an architectural teacher, and the approach and everything that he thought would be good in an architectural school, because he'd had some good students, or some good teachers at Harvard, and some very bad ones. And Smith was really the people in the art department were very much impressed by this letter, and they got back in touch with him again and said, won't you? So that was it. But the next year, I think it was, they said, won't you possibly reconsider? And we'll put all your classes on 2 days. You just have to spend one night in Northampton. And at that point, I was pregnant with Aaron. So here was Tara, just 1 year old, and all of a sudden another baby on the way. And Dad had designed a fraternity house over at the University of New Hampshire, but in those days they called architects in New Hampshire. And there wasn't any other job lurking on the horizon. And he thought, well, maybe I better reconsider. And of course, the two things worked out wonderfully together. That the students gained a great deal by having a practicing architect instead of just a theoretical teacher. And then the architecture his practice was a whole lot more interesting because of all the
feedback from students.
So anyway, after he got out of the sanatorium, he had been offered a job in Texas, go down and essentially design gold doorknobs or something like that. And there was a job in California that was a possibility. But after being in Italy and being in the sanatorium and reading a great deal and a lot of self-education, was wondering, do I really want to spend my life, doing that kind of thing? And we really wanted to explore our lives and not lead them, just traditionally the way it was sort of expected of us. We wanted to make somewhat of an experiment out of our lives. And we also, in those days, you didn't just pop on an airplane and go from one coast to another. We had been away from good friends and family for really quite a long time. You took a train if you wanted to see somebody, and 5 days later you arrived on another coast. And we knew that we would be totally, if we moved west, we would be totally separating ourselves from a lot of people that we cared a lot about. We had a lot of good friends and family. So we decided we'd make our lives in the East if we could. And my brother put heavy-duty pressure on us to move up to Vermont, where he had Tunturi, the farm on the Camel's Hump. And he had a very good friend who was an architect, who was a very wealthy guy, who had this incredible house and architectural studio right on the banks of Lake Champlain. He was a really, really nice guy. And he wanted Dad to go into business with him in his architectural practice. And it was very, very, very tempting. And I dug in my heels and did a little bit of weeping and everything and saying no, because much as I really adored my brother, who was very, very important figure in my life. We were very, very, very close. But I also knew that we would have to do what he wanted. And that wasn't what we wanted to do with our lives. He was a very persuasive person, but you do it his way. He was a really interesting guy, but there was no room for disagreeing with him. And I didn't want to be just under his thumb, So I dug in my heels and said, no, we just can't go to Vermont. And also, in those days, they didn't have, it was really back behind the beyond up there. We liked good theater, concerts, plays, a lot of good friends and everything in the Boston, Cambridge area. Dad had lots and lots of friends locally. And Vermont, there were no interstate highways going up there. It was a 5-6 hour trip. And Burlington was a cow town. Nothing was going on there. Now, it's a lively, interesting place now, but boy, 50 years ago, it was pretty sad. So we decided instead, we got out a map and we saw that there was this little triangle in southern New Hampshire that looked as if it had been bypassed by the tourist routes. And I knew Vermont fairly well, and Dad knew Maine very, very well because he'd gone to camp there many summers. But neither of us knew anything about New Hampshire. So at one point I think we were staying down, we just went down and spent a weekend with Aunt Hope or something. She said, "Oh, you're going to New Hampshire. You must look up Cousin Tasha." And we didn't know anything about Cousin Tasha. Turned out Tasha Tudor, his granddad's, I don't know, first cousin or something like that, close relatives. And we were looking around, we were in Concord, and Dad gave Tasha a call. She lived in Hopkinton, over to the west of Concord.